Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to this short lecture in the PROFRES gathering, University of Southeastern Norway. As you can see, I'm not at the University of Oslo, although that is where I usually work. My name is Thomas Hillen Eriksen, and I'm a social anthropologist, normally based at the University of Oslo, but as you can see from the background, which is not digital, by the way, it's analog, okay? I'm currently not there. I'm in a cabin in southeastern Norway, in fact, not very far from where my old friend and colleague Halvard Vike, whom you met the other day, lives and works. Had it not been for the pandemic, I wouldn't have been here. Either I would have been at home or possibly in the Caribbean doing a bit of fieldwork, but that was not to be. So this pandemic, which has now destabilized, influenced, changed, shattered parts of the human world in the last 7 months or so, is an event of global historical significance. We are now 7.7 billion. Hardly anyone is entirely unaffected by the pandemic. And yes, it is a health issue. It's an epidemic. Okay, it's a disease, but the implications and the effects of the pandemic go far beyond that of the disease. It shows how the different subsystems of the global society and of local communities are interconnected. There are indirect effects. Who would have thought that the fact that a man who was walking in the wet market in Wuhan, a major city in central China, who had a cough and maybe was running a fever, he wasn't feeling too good, how the fact that he walked in that wet market on a day, probably at the end of December last year, would, in the space of just a few months, send millions of people into unemployment, would lead Filipino families to wonder where the next meal was coming from, because they no longer received the $100 that they used to get from the relative working in the Gulf, or that the people who are running dog sledding companies in Svalbard, north of Norway, would desperately apply the state for funding in order to be able to feed their dogs because they no longer had any customers. That pubs would be closing down, that there would be no football on TV, at least for a while, in Britain and elsewhere. And that universities would be closed to the extent that virtually all teaching is now taking place digitally. Anthropology students could no longer go on fieldwork, which they were planning to do, our master's students, in March, April. And British economists spoke of the deepest economic crisis for 300 years, which is pretty dramatic. I think they have maybe the tulip bubble in mind. So this may be an exaggeration, but possibly not. Because to quote a statesman, whom I usually don't quote, a mid-20th century politician, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but possibly it is the end of the beginning. So we now have about 7 months' experience of a state of exception, which is global, which has brought our societies into a strange staccato rhythm of stop, start, opening, closing, optimism, pessimism, the search for a vaccine which may be generally available and which works for everyone, which will make travelling safe again. And then delays, uncertainties. NAV in Norway, the social welfare organization in Norway, almost overnight got 400,000 new customers, or new users, as they call them, which is fairly dramatic for a population of a little over 5 million, which in the last decades hasn't seen much by way of mass unemployment. So it's dramatic, it's radical, and it affects many spheres of life. Of course, it's a health issue, it's a disease. Whereas at the same time, the most lasting and most profound and most enduring and consequential effects of the pandemic are probably not to do with health, but the way we organize our lives. So the title of my lecture, as you can see, is Vulnerability or Sustainability, Implications of the Digital Shift. That's the aspect of the pandemic effects that I would like to focus on during this talk. The migration of a very large number of activities from the analog world to the digital world, and what it means, what it entails, what it implies, and perhaps how we can relate that shift to the sustainability goals. So every crisis can be seen as a magnifying glass and a catalyst. It magnifies certain tendencies that one has already seen in society. I mean, in the case of the pandemic, one of the things that has been magnified is probably xenophobia, suspicion of other people. Um, um, Diseases, epidemics have frequently, often been blamed on foreigners, strangers, minorities. It always used to be the Jews in Europe. I mean, the Black Death in the 14th century, up to the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, were by some blamed on the Jews and on other minorities. And we've heard intimations during this crisis, this pandemic, of blame on foreigners as well. Strengthened border controls would be part of that issue. Don't allow people in unless they have a really good reason for being so. And if we do allow them in, let's monitor them carefully. The American president, as always, represents an avant-garde in this respect, and spoke early on about the Chinese virus in order to put the blame on someone outside his own society. So some tendencies like that are being magnified. But also other tendencies, such as the realization of vulnerability that I'm coming to in a little while, going to say a few words of, and an enhanced understanding of what globalization actually is and how reliant we are, how dependent we are on being globally integrated in order to lead the lives that you and I are accustomed to. It's a catalyst in many ways as well, in the sense that tendencies that have always been there sort of over a while have been simmering suddenly take off. And digitalisation, clearly one of them. We've been able for about 30 years to give video lectures. Not quite like this, not quite from the laptop, not quite with this kind of nice software that makes it easy for us to devise some kind of lecture online. But video lectures have been available, have been possible. I gave my first in the first half of the 1990s. It was a big failure. we hadn't learned the mode of communication appropriate yet, but it was possible. And even so, in spite of the fact that video lectures have been possible for nearly 30 years, we continued until March 2020 to get up at 5:30 in the morning to catch the 7 o'clock plane to go to Bergen or Stockholm or Copenhagen or Amsterdam to maybe do a job that took us about a couple of hours. Spending a day or more doing this job, wasting money, and not least affecting the climate and the environment through flying. And yet we continue to do so. And now we no longer do, and we are learning how to conduct lectures online, to do doctoral defenses online, to have meetings, to have conferences, and so on. Affordances which were there for a long time, but which were barely being used unless there was some kind of emergency. So that's clearly a catalyst. What we've seen in my terminology would be the enforced cooling down on an overheated planet, my work in the last decade or so has focused very much on acceleration, on fast change. You notice that I speak fairly fast, okay? I sometimes try to slow down a bit, but it's not easy when you're used to speaking fast. But the truth is that you speak fast as well. The speed of speech is one of those many things that has accelerated, and where we have in the last 30 years seen an acceleration of acceleration, not necessarily regarding the speed of speech, but regarding many other things. In the last 30 years, many indicators are going straight up. And I'm not just talking about the number of smartphones in the world or the number of photos taken in the world, which has had a very steep growth because of the fact that most people now take photos with their mobile phones and not with a camera that you always forget at home. It's become very easy. I'm thinking about things such as world trade, which has grown by 400% in 40 years. Or the growth of cities in the global south, where cities that a generation ago had a few 100,000 inhabitants now have several million, without necessarily an accompanying changing in infrastructure. I'm thinking of phenomena, such as the amount of plastic in the oceans, the number of animals that human beings have gotten rid of. We've killed between 65 and 70% of all wild vertebrates since 1970. In so many domains which are interrelated through global capitalism and through technology and globalization and growth. So many phenomena have experienced a massive growth, a massive increase in the last generation or so. After the end, you might say, of the Cold War, the coming of the mobile phone and the spread of the internet, which took place around the same time in the early 1990s. We're talking about massive changes. Only between 2004 and 2019, the number of plane tickets sold in the world more than doubled, from 2 billion in 2004 to 4.5 billion tickets sold in 2019. Now, between April 2019 and April 2020, in 1 year, the number of plane tickets sold in the world decreased by more than 90%. Okay? So we talk here about a massive, sudden, unwanted, undesired, enforced cooling down, slowing down. This is something that people concerned with the environment and with climate have pleaded for a long time. We need to cool down. People like myself, have said, people who have a personal and also professional engagement in climate and the environment, we need to cool down. But nobody had believed or hoped that it would happen like this. Global interconnectedness is one of the lessons we've learned something about. We've learned about vulnerability. As has been magnified, the fact that we are vulnerable in the sense that we depend on processes, phenomena, events taking place in far-flung places, and we have seen butterfly effects. Butterfly effects, small causes can have enormous consequences if they are attached to some kind of causal change, some kind of process that enables this massive change. So that when a man in the wet market in Wuhan started to cough and was running a high fever, before you knew of it, people who were running dog sled businesses in Svalbard had to ask the government for financial aid because there were no longer any customers. And, we're talking about that sort of thing. Because this man coughed, a few months later, you saw hundreds of thousands of Indian workers who had been laid off walking along dirt roads in rural India on the way home to their home village because they no longer had work. Factories in Germany had to close their doors for a while because they no longer received parts from their Chinese suppliers because the Chinese factories had been closed down temporarily. So we learn about this. We learn about inequality. People cope with this in very different ways. People are able to cope with the pandemic in very different ways. Some pretty well. Up here, we're doing reasonably well. We have a well-organized state. We've got lots of money, and we have a low level of conflict in society. And it's also a fairly egalitarian society compared to others. In other parts of the world, things look much grimmer. And even in Norway, there are obviously inequalities. Some people can cope more easily than others. I'm coming to that also in a little while. And it's a catalyst. And could it be a catalyst for climate action? After all, most countries in the world have signed fairly ambitious agreements, climate agreements, starting with Kyoto in the 1990s and, with successive, as it were, agreements afterwards, committing them to reducing their carbon footprint. And not much has happened, to be honest. There's been a bit of greenwashing, a bit of window dressing, and some really sort of genuinely useful projects. But on the whole, the planet is still emitting more than we did in 1990. So could this be a catalyst for actually doing something about the rather ambitious climate goals that this government and most other governments in the world, except for a few very irresponsible places like the United States, have committed themselves to? And could it also be a pretext for a catalyst for scaling down, doing things in your immediate surroundings, traveling less, uh, maybe looking at food security, which has become a big issue after the onset of the pandemic, and reducing the speed, the overheated, large-scale uh, global trade that has grown so rapidly since the containerization of shipping. But to move on, yes, I mean there's no doubt that the digital shift has been accelerated. I've already suggested as much. Um, we have become those of us who were not digital natives in the sense that we were accustomed to communicating with each other via screens. Many of us have been forced to do so and have learned a bit in the process, I guess. We've got used to speaking to our own faces, like I'm doing now on the screen, without cringing. We've learned a bit about this. We've learned about traveling, for example. Maybe we've learned to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary travel. And a footnote one. I don't think that tourism is coming back in the shape that we were used to having it until earlier this year. Mass tourism. There's going to be too much anxiety, too much suspicion, too much hassle associated with travel in the foreseeable future for mass tourism to return. Yes, I mean, we're going to travel again. People are going to travel, but not in the same way, not in the same, relaxed, laid back way. It's going to be more of a project to travel. We've learned something about the significance of physical co-presence, which is also something that I'll be coming back to, but we can make a note of it right away. How important is physical co-presence? How much did we learn from digitalization about the importance of being in the same room and what that does to you? We have acquired some skills regarding online learning, haven't we? I think so. And in the world of work, there are now leaders of corporations and other managers, people at the managerial level, who are rather pleased with the digital shift because they see that it can enhance productivity, it can make people more productive. You have shorter meetings, more efficient meetings. Less waste of time drinking coffee and going to the toilet and asking people what they did during the weekend. You can conduct a meeting that would otherwise have taken 2 days and you'd have to go out of town and have dinner together. You can get that done in maybe 3 hours. So, and I'm not joking. I'm not making this up. We have cases of this productivity. The Canadian cultural critic Naomi Klein says that they promised us a Green New Deal, but it seems that what we're getting instead is a Screen New Deal, which is going to force us to work much harder and in a more alienating, less pleasing way, less nice way. A new digital divide that has arisen from the digital shift is clearly the distinction between people who can work from home and those who can't. People are encouraged in many parts of the world, including this country, to work from home now to the extent that they are able to. If they can work from home, they should. But lots of people, as you know, they can't work from home. If you work in a hospital, a shop, if you do some kind of manual work, you're a carpenter, you're a painter. You can't work from home, and you have to work with other people. And another divide, which is a social divide more than a digital, is that not everybody is able to honor the principles of social distancing all the time. If you live in cramped quarters, if you live in a small flat with many other people, it's very hard. So, okay, but let's have a look at online learning and research. I mean, this being a research school. What is our experience after these 7 months of online learning and research? Do we try to the best of our abilities to imitate what we used to do offline, try to do just the same thing, only online? Or do we try to take the new technology on its own terms and use it in other ways and in a more perhaps creative way? We've probably seen both. both the sort of the lecture with a PowerPoint and with a Q&A at the end, like this one, I have to confess, or can we use this more fluid, more flexible technology in more innovative ways? It's not just me who's not in the office. I've had lots of supervision in the last few weeks with BA students who are writing a term paper. So I gave them half an hour each. Okay, so I just ran through lots of them in the space of a week, and we had some really nice and interesting conversations. Some of them do write about the digital shift, and more than half of them were somewhere else. They were in the cabin, perhaps, or they were at home with their parents, because there wasn't any reason for them to stay in their tiny student room, since there was no offline teaching. So they were more flexible regarding space. Digitalization makes us more flexible regarding space. The question that I raised when I spoke about the increase in productivity is, does it make us more flexible regarding time? Perhaps less, because it's so easy to fill all the gaps with various kinds of activities. And the online lecture is the conventional form, whereas the multi-platform interactive learning strategy is a different variety, and that has also been tried out. And let me give you some examples of how that can be done. You can, when you do research, the classic way of doing anthropological research is by getting to know people personally. It's very time intensive. You hang around with people. It's what one of our mentors, Clifford Geertz, spoke of as deep hanging out. Okay, spend a lot of time with people. We can't do that anymore. We can't follow them around, but we can do online feedback. So how do we do that? Well, you can use social media platforms where you get sort of something which resembles casual conversations. Not the same thing, but it resembles casual conversations. Certainly if you have several platforms that you can access. You can we use messaging a lot. You can do online interviews. You can even have online mass service, which is fairly easy, and obviously which was quite common before the pandemic as well. But we can also organize breakout rooms with group chats and so on when we collect data. But let me just return for a minute to teaching. You can have flexible time in the Q&A sessions if you use an online platform. You can have a platform where people can ask questions. You could have an ongoing discussion which is continuous, which is not confined by a certain time. You can have lectures which can be accessed anytime, so people don't really have to be there at 10:15. They can be there at 10:45 or even in the evening. They can watch a lecture and get almost as much out of it. You can use the online platforms in interactive ways, which are often more interactive. That's our experience so far where I work, more interactive than the classroom situation, where there is a tendency that a few people ask questions and the rest don't. On the online platform, the situation is more democratic, the threshold may be lower, and it's easier for people to come in and raise their voice digitally. So there are affordances that we get online that we didn't get offline, which is interesting in itself. Now, as the Canadian media theorist Marcel McLuhan said, new technologies always add something and they take something away. So what is added here? What is taken away? I've said a few things already about what is being added through digitalization. But do they take away something which is inalienable, something that we cannot really do without? And I'm afraid the answer is yes. And that is the reason why we continued to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch a prompt morning flight and have a miserable day with too little sleep and too much stress and too much waiting in airports and too much waste of fossil fuels, money and time in order just to spend an hour, 2 or 3 in the same room with other people. 30 years ago, in his book Modernity and Self-Identity, Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, wrote about presence availability, which is a very useful word. but it didn't catch on. I think it might catch on now that we realized some of the implications of not having it, not having presence availability, not being able to be present. And digitalization may have alerted us to the significance of non-verbal communication, the micro communication that takes place with your body, with your gestures, with your facial expression, with your whispers, with the way you take notes on a pad, and the kind of social dynamic that arises through being present in the same room. When I was a student, we used to joke that the best lectures were the ones that took place in the canteen. You know, after the lecture, when we got together and had a coffee and discussed. It could be a Marxist view on kinship, or structuralist view on myth, or it could be anything. But those lectures or seminars were incredibly important, and they were improvised, they were unplanned, and they just happened. And this is exactly the kind of phenomenon which is taken away through the digitalization of communication, meetings, seminars, supervision, etc. What we sometimes speak of as serendipity in anthropological methods, serendipity named after a fictitious Indian Hindu goddess, Serendip, who is the goddess of fortunate circumstances, okay, of lucky coincidences. So the lucky coincidence is lost. Not always, not invariably, not inevitably, but there is something about not being in the same place which takes away some flexibility. We become more flexible, as I said, regarding space. We can be wherever we like, but we can become less flexible regarding time, because gaps are being filled up, and the empty time, which is not meant for anything in particular, which is a time when anything could happen, goes away. So perhaps the most important thing that we've learned from digitalization is not about the digital world as such, but about the analog world, because we've learned through absence. This is not to say that we should return after the pandemic, when the dust has settled and when we again can do as we like, to the situation before the pandemic. There are many tweaks, changes, innovations, new ideas, new ways of doing things that may come out of the pandemic, because as a liminal state betwixt and between, as the anthropologist Victor Turner puts it, when you're in the liminal state between two fixed positions, you're neither this nor that, but you're a little bit of both. You are in a privileged position to reflect critically on your own life, on your society, and on the world. So this is an opportunity for us to rethink and to view this situation as a window of opportunity to do things slightly otherwise. And I think, that the digitalization of many of the things we do, which reduces the need for travel, which saves us time, and which makes us more flexible regarding place and space, could be one bit, it could be one piece in the big jigsaw puzzle of trying to address the climate goals. Now, the question that we should discuss now, I think many questions, you can ask me any question, is to what extent we are prepared to do it, because everything comes at a cost. And the cost of digitalization is also quite clear, because if there is one thing we could say about human beings, it is that we are social people, and human beings on the whole, they like to be together with other human beings, at least part of the time. And if you're not able to do that in your work situation, in the situation of study, teaching, etc., learning, something very crucial is being lost. So how are we going to go about it? How can we use the digitalization and the shift from the analog to the digital, which has been accelerated through this catalyst, which has been the global pandemic? How can we use that to address climate goals? I think we can, but there is no easy answer as to how we should go about doing it. So on that note, I thank you for your attention so far, and I'm looking forward to your interventions in the next half an hour or so.